Welcome to BIM 1040 virtual session for week 9. Today's focus is going to be on the legal aspects, but before that, let's do a quick overview looking back on what we've achieved in the previous 8 weeks. So just going through the previous weeks, we started having a look at a brief introduction of BIM. So we gave an overview of how BIM, our perspectives around BIM. Then we talked about, in my opinion, the most important thing, the client requirements. This is where we focused on the employer's information requirements as defined by the UK. Essentially, it's what are our stakeholders asking for when it comes to BIM? What are those driving factors that are outside of our control that drive us to scope and schedule what we have to do whilst defining the project? Then we looked at the BIM execution plan. We did a comparison of the different templates between North America and United Kingdom. We talked a bit about the LOD spec, and we'll further look into the BXP down the road. We talked about software. You can't have BIM without software, and oftentimes people jump to software prior to understanding what we're BIMing and why we're BIMing it. We talked about sharing, how to collaborate our model relative to our models, how to share our information, how to share with those on our design team, how to share with contractors, how to share with owners. We talked about the BIM uses. And these are all of the things we could do with BIM, either to support the client requirements from week 2, or to support further efficiencies, or to explore new technologies. And depending on what our BIM use is, that will very specifically cater how we define and set up our project. We talked about the deliverable requirements. So part of how we define is how we have to deliver, and whether that is a digital file, or whether that is a collection of information, whether that is something that's cloud hosted, something that's shared with others, or a static snapshot of published content. And then the last session, we talked about defining a technical solution. So that was essentially taking a whole bunch of what we previously talked about and trying to pull together how we're going to achieve it. And then amongst that, we did have a couple of assignments, which we'll quickly touch on here. We compared the BIM execution plans, so just to compare and contrast. We built a collaboration solution, so it was more of a workflow diagram talking about how we're going to share the various models amongst the various parties for 3 project types. One was a design bid build high-rise building. One is a P3 public-private partnership rail transit project. And the other one was a design build water treatment plant. The idea here was to expose you to the different project delivery methods, as well as different project types, different softwares, and different means to collaborate. The current assignment that we have active is defining an overall technical solution. So that's taking one project, one approach, one delivery method, but defining BIM goals. So here it's not only the software that we're going to identify. So we've got the software, we've got deliverable requirements introduced, we have disciplines identified, and delivery requirements, essentially an EIR. Now we're trying to pull this together and understand what or how we would define a solution for both BIM authorship, design review, and collaboration. 3 fundamental pieces that would later form part of a BIM execution plan. So this is an assignment that's currently active and in progress. Now that we've achieved all of this, we're going to talk a little bit about legal and contracts in the next 2 weeks. And the first introduction to legal, it's more to bring an understanding for BIM coordinators as to why we're not just doing this all the time by default. So I always, when I present, I often say one of the biggest barriers to full BIM implementation is often people. Why would an architect and engineer just say no? Why wouldn't they just embrace all of this? What do they mean by, will I be liable? Will I be held accountable? Is it okay to turn over digital? What should I be afraid of? A lot of questions get thrown out. And, there's reasons for the fear. But let's talk a bit about now the contracts, and I'll go through a presentation about some of those fears. So the online portion of this hybrid course was to actually look and fill out the BIM contract appendix based on the solution you were creating in week 8. So it's just to give some ideas. Now, based on the work stoppage, that may or may not have happened. But what I'm going to do is, first, I'll open up these 2 contracts. I want to have a dialogue about them. And then we'll go into the presentation and then circle back to the contracts. So I'm going to introduce you first to this RAIC document 6. Being an architect, I'll use the architect's contract, but the engineering contract would be similar. This here is the standard form of contract that's delivered by the Royal Architectural Institute of Canada, which is a national governing body for architects. And then it's often adapted at the provincial level. So I can vouch that Ontario has their own version of this through the Ontario Association of Architects. That's irrelevant. The point is, there is a document. And what the document tends to do is define, I'll just go through this quickly, it's a contract. So this is a legal binding contract. It defines the contractual arrangements between the parties. Usually it's between the client and the architect, and a typical design bid build. If it's design build, it may be between the architect and the client who's the contractor. But here it's just saying client and architect agreement, defines the project, where it is, what the budget is for construction, puts that right up front. Anticipated schedule and modes of delivery. So some simple things, if you will, simple fundamentals. It identifies any consultants that the architect is going to engage. So let's say structural, mechanical, electrical, plumbing, for example. Consultants by the clients, maybe surveyor, noise specialist, something of that nature, maybe a furniture specialist. The fee, if it's fixed, a fee if it's based on percentage of construction budget, or what other basis. The percentage of payment that will occur between each phase. Now you'll see discussion of this a lot. If we're doing BIM, should I as architect be paid more earlier in the design? There's merit to that. Because if you remember at the beginning, I showed the curve where we say we try to make decisions in schematic as opposed to later on during the construction document. So if the typical curve would be increased percentage as we get towards number 4, maybe we try to change that to get a little more in the top 3. But this is a negotiation that occurs between the architect and their client. And then a retainment fee, which normally we try to press for. So then the rest, it gets a lot of legal items that get looked at, and I'm not going to go through every piece. What I wanted to talk, and then you sign it off, I wanted to come down to the general conditions. So a bunch of definitions are then in the contract, and then the general conditions talk about payments and penalties and interest and what happens if there's unknown things, who the architect is responsible for. And take note of this. There is a defined architect scope of service, and then there's a defined what the client is supposed to do. And those are very interesting because the architect is bound by what's in their contract. So think in the world of BIM, when the contractor or the client is trying to push the architect to do more simply because we're doing BIM. But if that more is outside of these defined responsibilities, should the architect do more? How do you define additional services, right? Those are things that always get talked about. So when So when we are trying to get more out of our models and you hear, I'm not being paid for that, it's often relating back to what's been defined in this contract or not. And then what's been defined as what the client should do, what the architect should do. Then the contractor will have their own contract. And then there's sometimes the question of what the contractor should do. So that's all here. I did want to come down to this clause right here, 6.6. This is a new and very important clause that has been added to the contract, the architect's agreement with the owner. If BIM will be used on the project, and the standard BIM contract appendix published by the Institute for BIM in Canada is appended to the contract, copyright for the model and model elements shall be set out in that contract appendix. And that's been put in there to address all the questions of who owns the model, who owns this, who's accountable, who owns these elements. The contract appendix is designed to supplement everything that's in this primary contract with the owner. Okay, so just dwell on that for a moment. And I'm now going to open up this contract appendix. And we'll come back to this contract appendix after the presentation. But this was developed in 2014, which prompted then the adjustment of the contract of the architect's contract with the owner. So this BIM appendix is designed to sit on top of the contract, again defining who the contract is between, what the definitions and the particulars are of the contract, and the signing people. It's got its definitions, and they've designed it so that there are no conflicting definitions between RAIC and IBC. I preface that because you may be in an organization like I am with IBI, where we do have internal documents that have been developed, or contracts that have been developed and enhanced for our purposes. And we need to make sure that when we apply this contract appendix that we haven't defined or conflicted. Now, let's look right here. Model element author is a concept that defines who's responsible for developing and contributing a specific element to a model. Now that follows upon the level of development matrix, the LOD matrix that we talked about in the previous weeks, and we'll bring that up in a bit. But what this is saying is, as we go through the general particulars of who, this defines who's responsible for building what. We decided that we'll share. We agree to incorporate this appendix into all of the contracts. We reasonable evidence that this is being applied, and we agree to share. Copyright, the model element belongs to and remains to the element author. And that's a very important thing because we talk about this all the time. Who owns my model? Well, I'm the architect. I own my drawings. I own my model. Now, when I transmit the model, I'm not giving ownership of my element. We're sharing for the sake of enhanced collaborative development of the overall whole. That's what BIM is. Previous presentations, I showed ArcStruct, Mach-Elect, all working together. Just because we're working together and sharing each other's models, that doesn't mean the consultants now own my elements and I'm not in responsible control of the architectural components anymore. So that's what this, and then the concept of it in here, granting a license to the participants to use my content for design and construction purposes. When I read this, it's very similar to turning over CAD files in today's world. This contract has been designed, or this appendix has been designed to help alleviate the fears of this digital turnover and what it means when I give you my model and you're going to go use it for other things, right? When I'm transmitting, the parties are relying on the accuracy as established by the LOD matrix, and then they take their own risk in order to use it for more than what was the intended purpose. We define the scope of what's being modeled. We define the uses of the model. If this is a design model that was intended to be used for those BIM uses, design authoring, design review, and visualization, and I, the contractor, am now taking this model and I'm trying to cost estimate, schedule simulate, link to asset management, I can do that, but I'm taking the risk, understanding that the authorized use are as defined in this appendix. And then this here defines that, yes, we understand that there'll be potentially post-construction uses, and whether or not we're listing ourselves as responsible for those uses or not responsible as part of this contract. And the description could be that we're not, because the contractor is going to be taking this on and it's outside of our scope completely. So this has been designed in that manner. Now, what I'm going to do very quickly is open up that LOD matrix that was part of week. I will locate it. There we go. Sorry, BIM execution plans, US. So it was part of the delivery that was given out. Well, maybe it wasn't in this piece. Sorry, let me just quickly pop open the BIM execution plan. Sorry, the LOD matrix, so you can just see an example of that. Maybe I did not deliver it to you, but for the sake of this recording, let me just very quickly get to it here. So the LOD matrix looks something like this. And we're just going to pause for one moment. Okay, continuing on. We're looking here at the LOD matrix, and continuing on the model element author, that's what this column here, these columns are showing. Who's responsible to model the specific components during each phase? So the BIM contract appendix is saying that once we define at a very high level the concepts of BIM authorship and what we're using the model for, it then says that we'll follow upon to a BIM execution plan and an LOD matrix that will define everything. And that's what this is saying here, using a model element table that we will fill out and subsequently be attached to a BIM execution plan. So it all kind of flows, and the idea of this BIM contract appendix is to introduce aspects of BIM into the binding contract and not rely on the fact that, hey, we're going to do BIM, let's start the project, and then let's think about who's modeling what and when, and then hopefully agree to it after the fact. This is saying that as an extension of the contract, this all becomes binding. So why am I explaining all of this to you? Always comes down to that question. What's the point of this, right? So we're talking about project definition and deliverables. So how do we define the project and ensure that the deliverables can be met? And what are the legal fears? So I explained to you, and we'll circle back to those contracts when we're done. I do want to talk about why are we afraid? Do that as a starting point. What is that initial fear that comes from architects and engineers? So this presentation was one that was developed in conjunction with Glaholt LLP, a colleague of mine who works with construction law, but was also trained as an architect with me. So together at architecture school, we took professional practice, and that's something that's always ingrained into us from the very beginning. How do we function as architects and designers in the world today? So just a quick disclaimer, this was prepared in conjunction with Andrea Lee, and this is not legal advice, it's just to get the conversation started. So when we ask the question, we look to see who's accountable. These are the BIM questions. Who is accountable for the information and when? Upon delivery or years later? What if the owner discovers a discrepancy long after the project is done? How is one professional liable when multiple professionals are authoring common models and common data? And I've talked in previous sessions about the interconnectivity of information and how living in smart cities, the world of the Internet of Things, anything I design is potentially connected and fed and enhanced by numerous other entities that may or may not reside within the design contracts. So what then happens when shared and virtual models become the deliverable? So we talked about, I showed you quickly the REIC standard form. I'm going to talk just a little bit about what it means here. Ensuring accountability is something that you'll hear a lot of. And imagine how in the BIM world, some of these responsibilities kind of get blended together. This is one of the roots of the fears or the fundamental reservations that we get when attempting to apply an overall BIM process. So the client's responsibility, make all information relevant to the project available. Think about that first one, available for us to rely on. But we talk a lot about existing conditions modeling. We go out there and do point clouds, scan to BIM. We bring this information into our models. Did the client do that? Are we forcing or pressing our clients to do that? Why are the contractors scanning existing conditions during design build projects and not the owners? Why are the owners not ensuring that their information is BIM ready in order to feed into our technological industry? So that first one is always an interesting bullet for me, because the whole business of existing conditions modeling being engaged by the design professionals is fundamentally different than in the traditional world, where I, the architect, will wait until I am delivered a survey from my client. Very different. And then you talk about engaging specialist sub-consultants. In the world of BIM, technological specialists are plentiful. And how does that relate to how we're doing? So just keep that in mind. I'm not going to dwell on all this. The consultant's responsibilities. So this is a typical items that come out of our contracts. Analyze requirements, coordinate with subs, maintain confidentiality, records of expenses, etc. So a couple things: analyzing requirements, defining scope of work, coordinating with sub-consultants. BIM kind of fits right into that. So when we talk about why not do BIM, we're often attacking those bullets where it is very easy to understand the benefits of BIM. But now records of expenses, records of services performed, etc., that starts to tie into project delivery systems, financial systems, etc. And one of the promises of BIM is, why is the effort that's done modeling, documenting, and delivering separated from the efforts that are done to run the business? And some advanced firms are trying to bring some fusion relative to the advancements of models versus the advancements of the project. Now, standard of care. This is one that is very, very important. So architects and engineers, if you read that, we don't guarantee the success of our work, and we're not liable so long as we exercised reasonable judgment, competence, and diligence. That's an important piece, because oftentimes you'll hear, oh, I don't want to do BIM, I could be found liable. You got to ask the question, liable of what? And that's a very important thing. Being liable for your work, it's a nice way of saying we're all accountable for our work, which we are. But being found breach of contract because of negligence means we weren't exercising reasonable judgment. And to have an argument saying BIM affects my ability to exercise reasonable judgment, that's kind of hard to believe and I would like to hear about that. Copyright. Same concept. You saw the IBC contract appendix addressing this. We design professionals maintain copyright of their projects unless there's an explicit item saying there's a turnover of copyright. Just because there's a model, there's still modeled elements that are owned by the element author, and therefore copyright laws all apply. It does not get destroyed because I'm turning over a model. And I'll keep saying for, 4 decades now, we've been turning over CAD files in digital format, had no negative effect on the copyright of the project or the design. So you understand, I talk a lot about project delivery, and next week's session, it's more of a project delivery fundamentals, if you will. I do this because in the BIM world, I've said if BIM is looked at outside of the realm of project delivery, then we'll have failure. So in the world of design, the American Institute of Architects defined the 4 phases: pre-design, design development, construction document preparation, pre-design, schematic design, design development, construction document preparation. And that basically goes from a 0% to 100% design, followed by bid, construction, and operate. All around the globe, any defined project delivery will have similar types of phases. So these are showing you some of the things that are done in the pre-design phase by architects and engineers. Once we get into design, and this would be schematic design, and into design development, drawings and specs are usually the contracted deliverable, but those are generated or linked to our building information models. So during this phase, the BIM is initially there to enhance and make efficient the tasks or the workflows required to achieve our contractual deliverables. Very critical. And the makeup and the definition of the information model has to be done in a manner that helps to facilitate the ability to achieve this. Bidding and negotiation, we aid in the selection of the contractors. This is in your typical design bid build, and ensure the information provided to bidders is consistent and meeting all of the bid laws. What does that mean to the BIM coordinator? If we hand the model to one bidder, we better be handing that model to all 10 bidders. Everybody needs to have that fairness. And we have an example here with some case law that was done. So the examples they chose, that in the negotiation phase, there has to be that connectivity and accountability so that the consistent delivery of information to the contractor will empower them to select the right means and methods. And that's a critical thing. And that's where there's this fear from the design professionals, if you will, that, the more you put into BIM, the more that will be interpreted and taken and pressed forward. And therefore, there's the risk on the design side that I'll be held liable for how something is selected to be built. And that's not exactly the case. We design professionals have a duty to advise, not a duty to decide. And the BIM, if misinterpreted, it's not the fault of the design professionals. So, an example, if in my information model, I show conduit, and the comment is, well, conduit is usually field routed. So if I show it going in this direction on these walls and it doesn't work, I'm responsible. No, the model is advising on a potential method. The contractor could say, nope, I'm going to route it differently. They route it differently, and then they update their model. All good. Very simple. This example here, if the contractor relied on information and it caused the loss, the engineer was liable. So here, they decided to provide information to be included in the tender package to prepare the price, and the information was incorrect. And here, without getting into details, the engineer was found liable because they needed to ensure the quality of the information was correct. It was deemed information that they were responsible for. So that's a big difference to this first example, where it's a duty to advise, versus this second example where the information was incorrect. And that's the difference. So again, relating this back to the topic at hand, I route the conduit to advise. I place the door in the model, and I specify a specific door. I specify the wrong door because I'm in a fire-rated assembly as opposed to not. I'm liable as an architect for that. But that has nothing to do with BIM. That's design, that's an error that needs to be fixed. Oftentimes, BIM is just used as a wonderful example to just not make things happen. Construction phase. This is where now, we're past design, a contractor is selected, and now there's this interaction between the designers and the contractor. My favorite part of this interaction as it relates to BIM: who's going to make this model? Who's going to continue the model? As-built versus record model. And the reason for this is the architect and engineer are not responsible for means and methods, and are not responsible for the actual construction on site. But we have a duty to review, inspect, general observation is the term we prefer, provide instructions and clarifications, and understand that there will be deviations from the contractor, from the plans. Now, a couple of examples here. This one here is saying that, safety on site is the responsibility of the contractor. So, oftentimes architects and engineers, they'll see things on site. They do have a duty to point out things that could be questionable, but it's the contractors who take full responsibility. Where they're updating technological requirements, if needed, with the models, where they're ensuring things are being designed. So just, the point of this is to give the responsibility. Let me go back there for a moment. To give just a quick understanding of some of the things we're responsible for as designers and some of the things we're not. So the concept of record modeling, I just want to dwell on that. While we're on site, we're watching, we or extensions of the design teams are watching these items come to fruition. And there's a fear, and it's right in here, a duty in tort. So there is a fear that when you hear, I may be liable, will I be found responsible in tort law? And tort law means an expected duty of care. I'm an architect. Should I have known that something would happen? Should I have known that something was wrong? Is it within the reasonable expectation that I would have identified that? And therefore, am I responsible? The fear in BIM is that because everything is connecting, am I responsible? And that's why the contract appendix was designed to help mitigate this and ensure that we're defining who's responsible for what, so there is that clarity by contract and therefore not an assumption by tort. We all carry professional insurance, so that's a requirement by architects, engineers. Contractors have to have insurance and bonds, etc. So the fear with the way project delivery is today is we're all pointing our fingers at each other if something goes wrong, to tap into these insurance monies in order to pay for the damages. So again, it's all the fear, all the ifs. So the decision was we need some form of BIM contracts in order to help mitigate this fear. So in the States, there's the E202 building BIM protocol and consensus docs 301. In Canada, I showed you the BIM contract appendix. So the BIM contract appendix, coupled with an LOD table and use authorization, allows us to very clearly in the contract say, this is what the model will be used for. These are the components that were going to be modeled, and thus this is where my potential liability will end. Now, when somebody says, will I be liable for something in the model? In my opinion, that's no different than somebody saying, am I liable for my design? The answer is sure. Why wouldn't you be? Just because there's a model, that doesn't mean your responsibility as an architect or engineer goes away. But because there's a model, that doesn't mean now you're liable for everything and unforeseen things and just a ridiculous amount of fear, thus prompting maybe we should have modeled. So that's what I'm trying to instill here. As I was going through this appendix here, very quickly, this presentation is going to pick out a couple of items that are of importance here. So one article, Article 1.5, requires everybody to use this appendix. So it doesn't help if I have this defined and I'm using it by myself. So the team is promising to attach this appendix to all of the contracts. And therefore, we are all bound by what's in the appendix, and therefore, we all agree. We clarify the participation of the contractor and the subcontractor. So if they're doing any modeling, they're not actually designing, that allows us, if, for example, modeling of fire suppression systems or modeling of components that are field routed, that doesn't mean they now assume the mechanical design responsibility. They're just modeling the components. We grant each other permission to use what we're modeling within the project. If there's alterations, so if I give you my model, I'm granting you exclusive rights to use my model during the project. If you alter, it's your risk, not mine. And that right away addresses the biggest fear. So what happens if I give you my model, and not only do you maybe alter my model, but what if you alter something else that was forming the basis for my decision in the model? All at your risk, not mine. Very important to understand. If after the protocol, they want to use the model for something else, you're a risk. Example there, and I've seen this a lot. We're only using the model for design authoring, design review, and visualization. Somebody else wants to use it for schedule simulation. Use it. You're a risk. So you cannot come back and say, hey, you didn't model the column. The example of the column that's modeled 10 stories high. If I'm a good modeler, I'll probably model it story by story. But if I model it 10 stories high, doesn't really matter, because if it meets my purpose, it meets my purpose. Now there's discussions around that, but that's the concept. I model a wall and I don't show the pour joints because I don't need to. If a contractor wants to take it and use that and further that, they can do that at their sole risk. That's the whole point. So then we set out the extent of what's being modeled, and this allows us to state whether or not we're using models solely for design purpose, for advanced analysis, for asset management, etc. And then it allows us to prep these models if we know that there's going to be a post-construction use. That's a very critical piece. We set out who's managing the model, the defined level of development, when the milestones are, and then a model element table. Now, if I go back to that section 5 here, The model element table could be something that's built into the appendix or attached as an like an LOD matrix attached to it, which is often what we do. And that's what it's saying here. It has the option of using either the provided element table or their own detailed one attached to the protocol. There you go. Another quick example here. This is one of the BIM litigations that came up, and it's typical. The contractor created an initial BIM based on the plans. The BIM didn't include everything that was in the plans. And then they wanted subcontractors to participate in BIM. And then once they started modeling, they encountered that the conditions were different from what was bid on, submitted a change order, and the change orders were rejected. Now, once there was that rejection, it led into the dispute. And obviously there was a back and forth between the contractor and the sub, that the change order fell within the scope of the what was contracted, and they failed to prove that there was a change order that were really a result of a change, and therefore the work had to be completed. So I show this as an example because we come across this a lot, and again, this all goes back to the BIM fear. Why are we afraid to quote do BIM? And this is a great example where, you know, and I've seen this with subcontractors where they may not be BIM savvy, they may be pressed into BIM, and then they have to address, you know, the unforeseen things that may come from the BIM world. And oftentimes, you know, when we look at this, we have to understand that, you know, if at the beginning we have this appendix, we are all working on the same framework, we're all tied together, we know there's going to be models, we know there's going to be information, and we're putting into the models the right level of development, that allows us to avoid things like this, where trying to work off of 2D plans, which are only as complete as they can be because they're 2D plans. The more robust the information, the more connected the information, the better we are to achieve these sort of things. Now in the UK, talked about BS 1192. We've talked about their BIM execution plan. They have pressed for a full 2016 deployment of what they call level 2, which is just basically a coordinated model where we're all collaborating. That was the pressing factor relative to BIM in the UK. They are moving towards level 3, which is looking at more data interoperability and data connectivity. As governments and agencies are pressing for this, this will help to alleviate the fears of should we do BIM, should we not do BIM? Well, if it's a requirement, we're going to do it. Therefore, we better understand what that means contractually and what that means from a design, just from a perspective of being a professional. We've looked at this CIC protocol, which is their version of the BIM contract appendix, and it was published alongside their BIM management strategies and requirements. So there's something, you know, with that, there was a little bit of a legal background just to try to help bring an understanding of, you know, how do we function and why do we function the way we do? And being aware of the fact that, you know, architects and engineers are not saying no to BIM just to say no. They do have this genuine fear. So part of our roles are to bring education and understanding to corporations, ensure we have tools, software, procedures, all of that good stuff, and to bring a comfort level around what it means to be applying the BIM process, what it means to be delivering intelligent models, and how that is meant to enhance the professionals, not potentially hinder. So we talked about the BIM contract appendix. The one thing that we do at IBI and several I've seen in the industry is we include limit of liability waivers for digital turnover as well. Now, if you have the BIM contract appendix, it kind of mitigates the use of the digital tools. Oftentimes we have projects where the contract appendix is not in existence, nothing is signed. Therefore, with any turnover of BIM or CAD, we include this liability. And it's kind of like a waiver when you go to a website and you sign your user agreement to do the website. Hopefully you all read what you're signing. But what it's saying is, we're giving you the model. The model was designed for this purpose only. Use at your own risk for something else. We force both parties to sign, and that's it. Sorry, let me go back to that. And I think the point here is to ensure, and I'm going to keep using the example, if I'm going to give you the model and you're going to now take a full material quantity of it and do a cost estimate, I want to be explicit to tell you that my model was really just designed for architectural purposes, for example, and therefore I may not have modeled all of the finishes because I may have scheduled them. I may have something in my spec. And if I have something specified in a written spec, I may not need to have all the particulars in my model. I may have heavy detailed wall sections, and therefore the walls in my model are just calling out a wall type. So I need to outline the specific limitations that are in my model and ensure that there is an agreement in place with both parties, understanding that this digital information was designed or developed for one purpose, and therefore you are now choosing at your own risk to enhance it. And that's what the IBC BIM Appendix focuses on. Just closing this piece, wanted to touch here on the types of project delivery. And again, I think this is the third time I've brought up this slide, and I'm going to start next week with this slide as well. This is a very important piece relative to how design professionals function and interact with their contractors and owners. So the slides I showed here, for the most part, we're talking about the design, bid, build arrangement, that top one. This was, and probably still is, the majority, but this was the way the contracts were for a great many years. Architect is contracted to owner, contractor is contracted to the owner. There's an implied relationship between architect and contractor. Now we're seeing many more times, and it's typically this middle one, the design build arrangement led by the contractor. The architect and engineering consultants are attempting to ensure that they have the ability to maintain their professional responsibility without increasing liability and potential risk, and coupling that with the fact that there's the existence of this digital model that pulls all of our information together. So it's a new environment. A lot of the resistance or perceived resistance comes with, not fully understanding BIM, not being well understanding of the fact that, you're still modeling your components, you're still professionally responsible for what you always were. There's only an enhanced integration and fusion together of that data, supporting advanced technologies and advanced data use throughout a project lifecycle. So, the world isn't going to change, but people like us are the ones that empower to bring an understanding that, yes, we understand the fears of liability, we understand where you're coming from, but the world is changing. And changing, in my opinion, for the better, this world of integrated project delivery. The more fusion we have of architect, engineer, owner, and contractor in an environment that mitigates risk and promotes sharing, will only work to enhance the world of BIM. So looking forward, right, we want to leverage standardized content, available forms, waivers, etc. Don't assume that BIM changes what it means to be a professional, okay? It's a process meant to enhance and not complicate. But of course it complicates when there isn't a full understanding. So understand what BIM is, how to document, how the BIM process is being applied. That comes to us, the BIM coordinators. Getting us involved at the beginning when contracts are being signed. That's the best, because I'm now able to go with my legal team, waive the contract appendix for BIM, ensure that there's aspects of it that are being understood and outlined, and ensure that there's a need to have a well-defined BIM execution plan, level of development matrix, and all the pieces that go along with that. So that's basically what I've just did there. Understand the contractual obligations, engage any legal service, whatever's at your availability, and then engage BIM professionals to guide the project. All of our failures happen when those things are not happening. Somebody signs on the dotted line, makes a promise, not really sure what was promised, and that really leads to catastrophe. So that's all I had on the slide this week. I just want to go back to these documents now. So understanding there are these contractual arrangements, the general standard contract says if there's BIM, apply the appendix. And especially if you're working globally, you may or may not see it or may not be there. If you're working for major organizations, they may have their own contracts. These clauses may not be there. But that's just a flag to say, if we're applying the BIM process, how are we applying the BIM process? And then fill out, read through and understand all of this. The most important part are the section 4 and 5. Now, the modeling scope and the protocols are really, if you think of it, it's a very high-level summary or outline of what will then be in the BIM execution plan. The problem in the BIM industry is oftentimes we sign these contracts and verbally say, yep, we'll do the BXP later. And then there's arguments over what goes in that execution plan. So the concept here is to say, in the contract, the model will be used for this. This is the only reason we're modeling. Get that agreement amongst the design professionals so that we're not fighting about how much BIM we're doing down the road. And then we can define who's doing what, who's our model manager or our BIM coordinator, whatever the term is. Obviously, this is an architect's focused contract, but who is the BIM coordinator at which milestone? So is the architect providing the model manager from the beginning? Maybe at construction, it's going to become a contractor model manager. If it's design build, who knows? Define these things. Ensure that this level of development matrix is filled out and correct. Now, this LOD matrix, I'll just quickly show a bit of this. This is one that we've pulled from some of the standard. There's one provided by the LOD forum. So we pulled it into IBI and enhanced it a bit. The problem with the LODs, the standard LOD matrices, the biggest problem is really they don't have all of the pieces that may apply to a project. So what we did first is we said, well, talking back on those classifications, we don't know what classification may or may not be used on a project. So we said, let's take 5 of them. And we mapped a classification to every single component that we have listed. That allows us to ensure that the model element authors know what to select in their BIM authoring tools if they're not already pre-selected on the components. We defined most of the disciplines that we have so that as we go from schematic design to design development, construction docs, so this is your 10 to 30, 30 to 60, 60 to 90 to 100, and then as built post-construction. We defined what the LOD level is, so 100, 200, and then up to 300. And take note, this is a point of discussion all the time. As-built models. As-built does not mean I, the architect, am now going to make an LOD 400 model. 400 is a construction level model that they will do, they, the contractor. As built or record model basically means we take our design models and we update it to the as built condition. We don't update it to make it developed as constructed. And the example there is you have a beam going into a column, and maybe the beam became 5 inches deeper. Well, we make the beam deeper in the model. We're not going to go and model the connection joints and the bolts and the weld points and all that stuff. That's LOD 400. I have a door that increased in size. We increased the door. We have walls that became thicker. We make the walls thicker. I'm not going to worry about the concrete rebars. That's usually just detailing work that's done. And then it may be rebar models on the contractor side, but unless that was part of the scope of services of the structural engineer, they're not going to go and model the rebar. So with that, you go down the LOD matrix. What we tend to say is, if something doesn't apply, you delete it. So let's say we're not modeling any interiors. I would hide or delete the interiors from my LOD matrix. The services, plumbing services, is where mechanical will define to what extent they're running their components. Now, I want to make note of a couple items here, and let's do note here. There are some items that only go to level 200. So these are the items where we're only doing a representation of them, and therefore we're not bringing them to a higher level. So there is that ability to review and understand how much parking lot marking and signs. We'll just show a brief schematic representation of them. Somebody else will define that in site during construction. So not everything will reach a full LOD 300. A grounding system that may just have a high level schematic definition until things are built and somebody is contracted, a subcontractor comes in, designs the system and implements it. So the electrical engineer is just going to basically write the requirements for it. That's why it's at 100. This is an LOD matrix. This is what's being referred to over here in the IBC appendix. And that's why I definitely recommend having the matrix as an attachment, because it can then be catered and specifically designed to suit the purposes of your specific project. So with that, I'm just going to end this talking from the BIM perspective. Again, we've got to circle back to the purpose, project definition and deliverables, right? So this whole concept of the LOD matrix is designed to help define what the project is doing. And if you think from a project definition and deliverables perspective, the entire premise of what we're BIMing and why we're BIMing will be bound by the legal requirements and constraints put into the project. So it's interesting, as we've gone through the weeks, and it's kind of comical, if you will. The owner is going to define. Your execution plan is going to be your Bible. You may have restraints by software. You may have restraints by where and how you're sharing. Your specific BIM uses. You saw the gambit of BIM uses, but legally, we're going to restrict what uses are being done where to define the roles and responsibilities. Deliverable requirements will define deliverables potentially as set out by our client, deliverables as set out by the legal constraints. So am I delivering DWG files to my client, but also promising a model turnover to my contractor? The technical solution kind of pulls it all together, being cognizant also of legal. Looking into next week, the legal constraints are bound by the modes of project delivery. So what I'm going to use next week's session is to look at a little more closely, not specifically the modes, design bid build versus design build versus P3 versus IDP, but I'm going to look at some project delivery fundamentals, which us as BIM coordinators need to be cognizant of in order to ensure that we're meeting the needs of the project. Then we'll pull it all together, look at some case studies, look at some BIM in action, look at workflows leading into the final BIM project, execution plan project. So with that, I'm going to close this week. A couple of reminders, assignment 8 is out and available. Please do your best to complete assignment 8 and obviously upload it via the system. There is another quiz that's open right now, and this will be quiz number week 9 quiz. So it's now available. Please do take that as well, and I'll put that in the announcement reminders. Thank you, everybody, and I hope you enjoy this recording, and we can definitely follow up when we're back live. Have a good day.